Welcome to another edition of the Father Tim Talks. Today's presentation is going to be, I've entitled The Meaning of or in Suffering in the Book of Job. I thought as we're kind of going through, the deaths that we're facing in our country today and all around the world, it might be an appropriate topic. This is an adaptation of a lecture that I did for my college students, all the seniors, when I was teaching college. And so I've adapted some of the things with this regard. First off, suffering. What is suffering? Suffering, it can be seen as a response to the threat of the integrity of the self. It just throws our world completely off guard, and we wonder, how are we going to make sense of this? And it is an individual response. It's undergoing pain, either physical, mental, spiritual, or psychological. And what for one person may be a slight discomfort, may be because of other circumstances, be suffering for another. The word suffering comes from the Latin sub, which means under, and ferre, which means to bear. So suffering literally means to bear under. How do we make sense of this? I think we all try to do this in our own ways. So we want to reflect a little bit on that. I want to look a little bit at the origins of evil, which brings about suffering. Uh, we'll look a little bit at how do we cope with evil and suffering. And again, these are going to be kind of individual responses that each of us deal with it differently. My method in this presentation is theological, and I take my definition of theology from St. Anselm, faith seeking understanding. How does our faith enter into our reflections about suffering? Scholars of religion often distinguish between two types of evils, natural and moral evils. And now, not all will agree with the idea of natural, but I think we can all see, that natural evils can bring about suffering as well as moral evils. Natural, or what some will call physical evil, is suffering that's brought on by the events of nature. And some will say it's evil by analogy. It's like the evils that are brought about by other people. For example, natural evils could be floods, tornadoes, hurricanes, etc. And all these things presume some sort of order in the universe. We know that when high pressure, low pressure come together in a rapid way, it's going to bring about lots of rain, which could cause lightning and flood damage. So natural evil is the evil or the suffering, the bad things that happen because of nature. Moral evil, on the other hand, is evil that results from human choices. It can be either by omission, where we don't do something that we ought to, or it can be commission, where we do something that we know is wrong. Examples of moral evils are genocides, murder, terrorism, etc. Those evils, those that cause suffering that are brought about by the choices of humans. Some examples. As I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, this is an adaptation from a lecture that I did in 2016. And each year that I did this lecture, I would try to find examples from the prior year that represented moral or natural evils. And I was just fascinated by, when I look back at this, some of the very same things are happening 4 years later, as we'll see in a moment. Natural disasters, they're all around us. But it's interesting to note that they seem to be kind of less of on a scale this past year than in the past. For example, fewer people than average, 2,900 people in total were killed by natural catastrophes this past year. 38% below the total from the first half of 2019 and nearly 90% below the 30-year average. So in some way, either the natural disasters are not being as disastrous or that we're being more prepared for that. Financial losses were just slightly below the 30-year average over the same months of 2019. And this was from a source July 25th of 2020. One of the ones that I was prominent back when I gave this lecture in 2016, it happened during the summer, June 12th of 2016. where one of the nightclubs in Orlando, Florida, a shooter came in and killed 49 people and 53 were wounded. That was on the minds of people continuing into the fall. And even to this day, I remember seeing a Remembrance Day on June 12th in Orlando for the victims of this shooting. During this time also, it was slightly before it was in the fall, that police had killed two, as you see, African American men in 2 days. Again, sounds familiar to what we're facing these days. Also interesting to note that in 2016, 64 police officers were killed by gunfire. Of all the causes of deaths of police officers, I just picked 64 because I figured that would probably be those resulting in when they were doing their duty and were killed by perpetrators. As of August 15th of this year, there were 29 killed by gunfire. Again, a reduction in since 2016, but still is kind of unacceptable to this day. We can't, you had to be living under a rock if you didn't see these two. In 2020, George Floyd was suffocated to death by that officer who had his knee on his neck and he couldn't breathe. And then also Breonna Taylor was a paramedic, I think in Kentucky, who was shot by police officers as well. So these things continue. Not looking at any kind of guilt or getting into politics, but these things were happening. It's interesting. One of the slides that I had in 2016 was this photo here of Black Lives Matter, and we obviously hear about that in 2020. Some of the same things we find again and again. In Chicago, and I used to use Chicago as an example because a lot of our students used to be from Chicago, and we only lived about an hour south of Chicago. In Chicago, there were 500 murders through September 8th of 2016. As of August 16th of this year, there have been 464 murders. One of the most frightening ones is that there were, in this period of this year through August 16th, 38 children were killed in gunfire. These were not by police, but most often by gang violence or shooting someone by mistake. They were just caught in the line of fire. The most staggering one there is that there were 5 children under age 10 who were killed due to gunfire. This is an interesting graph that I found from the FBI Uniform Crime Reporting Program. This graph here illustrates the number of murders per 100,000 residents. As you see in the yellow there, this came from Chicago, there were 20.7 murders per 100,000 residents of the city of Chicago. It's even more frightening as we look up at the top there in St. Louis, there were 60.9 murders per 100,000 residents. One that's kind of blotted out at the bottom there is in Fort Wayne. There were 12.9, I believe it was, murders per 100,000 people. Now, it's staggering. We look at these, the number of murders, again, as examples of moral evils in our day. One of the viruses that I talked about in 2016 that some of you may remember was the Zika virus. And the World Health Organization declared that the Zika virus was a global public health emergency, and that infection had been linked to thousands of babies being born with underdeveloped brains and thus didn't make it. And now we have the infamous COVID-19 virus. As of this day, Monday, August 24th, there have been 5.72 million cases of COVID diagnosed in the United States and 177,000 deaths here in the United States. Again, this does not take into account those who had the virus who don't show symptoms or recovered from it, which is a very high percentage. But the numbers are staggering. Worldwide, again, as of this date, in August 24th, 2020, worldwide there are 23.4 million cases of the coronavirus and 809,000 deaths that were attributed in some form to COVID. Again, this would be an example of a kind of a natural evil. The question then arises, how do we deal with this? I think it calls forth a number of different responses, and of course it varies from individual to individual. One of the ways in which scholars of religions and theologians kind of deal with this question is by what we call a theodicy or theodicies. A theodicy is a justification of God's creation in the face of evil. What place does God have amidst all this evil that we find in our world, both evil and both natural and moral? For Christianity, it poses a couple of other significant questions. One is, if God is all good and created all, then where does evil come from? Some natural evil we can point to the order of the universe, as I mentioned, where some natural forces, just because of the order of nature that was established, sometimes those go awry and we have the consequences of that. Or of human freedom. That's where moral evil comes from. The choices that humans have to do something or not. Then for Christians, we face a problem of, we look at our redemption as through the suffering and death of the innocent Christ. The Paschal mystery, that life came from suffering and death. But if we look at this, the suffering of Jesus seems to be out of proportion to the sins of himself. There was no sin. Jesus was innocent. And so it causes a little problem for us. If we look at in terms of moral evil, we can trace it back to say, well, it arose because the first parents, Adam and Eve, were tricked by the serpent into disobeying God. The devil made me do it. We see a picture here of Michelangelo's on the Sistine Chapel ceiling of Adam and Eve being expelled, and we see the devil there that made them do that. Again, I mean, if we're really thinking about it, you say, well, where did that evil come from? Well, it comes from Adam and Eve. Where did that come from? They got it from the devil. Where did the devil get it? So we look at it, raises a question, something for us to think about. We usually attribute evil to the devil or Satan, or what's known as the adversary. In next Sunday's gospel, we see Jesus calling Peter the Satan. Get behind me, Satan. Satan is the adversary. In the book of Job, we find that in chapter 4, that Job says, even his angels he charges with error. Angels are pure intellect. They're rational beings. And even in them, some chose to be like God, and that they have fallen from God's grace. So we can look at, that's how evil got attributed to Satan, that it started with Satan, that even they chose to be like God, be something that they were not. Philosopher of religion, Langdon Gilkey, said that Satan and the fall, original sin, are really symbols of evil. That in what we're talking about there, we can look at those saying, that whether it was angels or Adam and Eve, the first humans, they were creatures. They were not creators and therefore not God, and they tried to be like God. There are certain what we call anthropological issues that we face here. Anthropology is the study of the human person. So, if humanity or existence is it fundamentally evil, just totally self-interested? You let humans to their own devices, and they'll, take over and will cause all kinds of havoc. Or is humanity and existence fundamentally good? That there's value and meanings in our lives and our experiences, and even something we can find in suffering meaning. So it raises the question there, what do we think about the nature of humanity? Are they fundamentally evil schmucks, or is humanity and existence fundamentally good? Back in the 1990s, some of you may remember the massacre, the school shooting that happened in Columbine, Colorado. And this was the cover of the Newsweek magazine that following week after the shooting. And I think it's just striking, the big headline there, why? Why did this happen? We have several, what we try to do, natural explanations. Try to get to the cause of this, because if we find the cause, then in our technology and our know-how, we can fix it. What some studies have found, there's individual biology or chemistry, life experiences, and the larger cultural surround all have some play in this, as we'll see here coming up. There are numerous biological explanations that some scientists have found for why people do the things that they do. In a study of Dutch sociopaths, there was only 14 in the sample size. They all had an identical form of gene on the X chromosome. So the thinking was, if well that's the case, we can go in and genetically engineer that gene to do away with that, which would then do away with the sociopaths. Others found a low MAOA enzyme, and that they found that in animals studies who had a low MAOA enzyme, it led to animal aggression. In humans, what they found is that studies showed this only in children who had been neglected. So it was not a one-to-one correlation. In the social sciences, we find that more than 90% of mass murderers are male. That's kind of a frightening thing. Some they're described as aggrieved, they're hurt, they're clinically depressed, socially isolated, and paranoid. And many of them see this, it's the fault of others. Society made me do this. And 45% of males and 69% females committing violent crimes by the age of 17, they found were overly aggressive in childhood. Again, it was not 100% of these individuals. But I found it interesting that 17% or 69% of the females committing violent crimes, they found this overly aggressive. More in the social sciences. Some social scientists suggest that this is perhaps a reflection of the American propensity toward violence, stemming from our early history when we had the rugged individuals and frontier justice. When you go out west, the folks went out there, they really had to be, rugged individuals, and then they would often take care of things for their own. Somebody agrees me, I go take care of that. Looking at the homicidal violence in different countries kind of illustrates this as well. In Japan, it was found that the murder rate, and this was from a few years ago, was 1.1 homicide per 100,000 people. In Britain, it was 1.5 per 100,000 people. In Turkey, 2.5%, and in the U.S., it was 5.9 people per 100,000 violence that were killed by violence. Again, kind of shows we're kind of up there. Is it a product of our culture? What really happens though is that there's really in these studies nothing really conclusive. That kind of the blocks stack up, as my little graphic shows here, and they fall down. Biology, brain circuits, messages from the world, that's all a part of it. And in this article detailing these studies, it says no single experience or character trait is sufficient and no single one to blame. There's more to it than that. So how do we deal with this now? In the book of Job, we have the classic treatment of the problem of evil. It's looking at the problem of natural evil and suffering. In the book, we have Job's quandary, why is this happening? And then we have his friend's response, and then God's response. The question then is, Job is wondering, why is this happening? I've lived a good life. Why is this happening to me? The book of Job kind of outlines the limits of the human condition that we also know from our human experience as well. Operative in the book of Job is a theory that we call retribution. Retribution is the idea that good will be rewarded and evil will be punished. And so we look at then if we're being punished, then one must have done evil. The arrow goes to the other way. And this is a little bit operative in the book of Job, I think. The response to this is not. Job's quandary then. His quandary is in the form of a lament. He's kind of asking God for a hearing like a prayer petition. In a lament, in the traditional way that it's used in the Hebrew scriptures, is the guilty party acknowledges they're wrong, but Job insists on his innocence. He's done nothing wrong. So the question then arises, is it only good things that happen to good people and bad things that happen to bad people? I think we know the answer to that is, but subconsciously, I think we think, if we do good, we're going to be rewarded, and that the bad people are going to be punished. Job's friends try to help him out through this. They come to offer comfort. And they spent 7 days and nights with him. So these were really good friends. They just didn't come in, say their piece, and then take off. What they did is, though, they failed to understand Job's curses are really cries of pain. Job is hurting for obvious reasons. They don't want to risk their moral certainty, their knowledge. And so that's where we get some of the issues that come in the book of Job. One of his friends, Eliphaz. Eliphaz is the oldest of his three friends. Eliphaz buys into this theory of retribution. It's divine justice. God punishes evildoers and rewards those who are good. That's the way God works. Eliphaz appeals to his experience. He's seen at work, he says. You plow iniquity and sow trouble, that's what you're going to get. The hungry eat of their harvest. In other words, if you sow iniquity, you're going to eat of that harvest. So maybe Job has closed his eyes and not seen his wickedness. It gives him something to think about. Second friend, Bildad. Bildad is a bit younger. He also appeals to the tradition of divine justice that he's seen at work there. But it's not Job's experience, but maybe of a former generation. Or it could be Job's son or daughter. Some way, this is the way justice works, God works, that evil is going to be punished. And so if someone is punished, they must have done something wrong. Final friend, Zophar. Zophar is the youngest of the three and has almost a certain little arrogance about him. He appeals to a self-authenticating wisdom, namely his own. He says, divine justice is at work, repent and get over it. We figure this out then. The three friends, they note that suffering comes from God. God is just, therefore Job has to be guilty. Job, on the other hand, sees suffering comes from God. I am innocent, therefore God is unjust. A third possibility is that suffering happens, that God is just, Job is innocent, and there's no therefore. And this comes from a book called The Book of Job by Stephen Mitchell, where I got that. It was interesting to think about. It's one that really doesn't answer the question at all. It kind of leaves us in a mystery. Then God, in the book of Job, responds from the storm. God says, where were you when the world was created, when the order of the universe was set in place? Do you know the cosmos? Would you know how to operate it? Do you have power and authority? In some sense, God is putting Job in his place. Of all the intricacies of the universe, does Job really understand this? No. And so, there's just some things that Job and we are not going to understand. So what's wrong with the friends? They try to help him. They presume, that God is omniscient, all-knowing, and omnipotent, all-powerful. Humans are not, and so God's ways are mysterious. We won't ever fathom the wholeness of God. When we try to read the mind of God, it's like the fall, Adam and Eve trying to be like God, trying to be something that we are not. Are there really any answers then? There's really no one size fits all. The answers can't be imposed from outside. Most of them have to come from within ourselves. It comes from within the person and how that person responds. In a sense, then, we're left with mystery. Pope John Paul II, in an encyclical letter, Salvifici Doloris, in the 90s, he said, that God expects the questions and listens to our struggles. He knows the pain that we're in. And he said there's truth to Job's statements. Possessions are not only nor always taken from the wicked. Sometimes life is not fair. But then in the book of Job, Job's prosperity is restored at the end there twofold. He was twice blessed by God, but it was not quite the same. So in Job, it really doesn't answer the question about retribution. There's still a hint of that there. that Job was faithful and good so that he was rewarded. There was a book that we used to use in a class. It was by Elie Wiesel. It's called Night. Elie Wiesel was a teenager during World War II, and he was a Jewish young boy, and he was sent to the concentration camp of Auschwitz. And this narrative, Night, is a narrative about his experiences. Elie describes this one scene that still sticks with me to this day. He describes how the Nazis had lined up all the prisoners and made them walk in front of this line of three guys who were hung on the gallows. One of them was a younger young man, and his weight was not enough to kind of, bring the rope around his neck, and so he's just swaying in there. And Elie hears somebody behind him saying, "Where is God now?" And Elie hears the voice from within inside himself. There he is. He's hanging on the gallows. So the idea of redemptive suffering in Elie Wiesel's is a God who suffers with us. That in Jesus, who knew suffering and death, that God knows the suffering that we face. What is redemptive suffering? It's a search for meaning, as we see in our suffering as a benefit for others. Again, some of others may remember back when we hurt ourselves and the good sisters teaching us to say, offer it up. That was an idea about redemptive suffering. It's to help us find meaning in suffering. On a personal level, we can see that we go through some rough times, some see them as a time of testing. It can cause us to grow. It can also use some fancy words here, be a vicarious identification or empathy, that we're able to feel with someone. And then we can see that finally as seeing it for the sake of others, as the suffering servant in the book of Isaiah. So in growth, we look back on our experience, we say, yeah, I grew from that experience. So these are always, looking back on that. In vicarious identification, or we see our, suffering, when someone's been through something, we have a way of feeling with or being empathetic with them. We know how they feel because we've been through that as well. And finally, we can see that for others. We see some way in which we can see our suffering, the pain, suffering we're going through, as being for us. Does this fully respond to the question? Probably not. One theologian wrote that theologians should not give easy answers to difficult questions, but help us, people, to speak of God for themselves and in their own language. Maybe we may come to the idea of a God who suffers with us. I hope this was helpful for you today, and I hope you come back for the next Father Tim Talks.